morning, everyone. My name is Lauren, as you all know, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook. Cathryn is the founding executive director of the Future of Diplomacy project at the Harvard Kennedy School, which examines the challenges to negotiation and statecraft in the 21st century. In 2018, she was also named executive director of the project on Europe and the transatlantic relationship at the Harvard Kennedy School. From 2011 to 2017, she served as the executive director of the India and South Asia program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, also at the Harvard Kennedy School. Throughout her career, she has served as a journalist, a journal editor, a producer, and a consultant. And in 2017, she was named an Eisenhower Fellow for her leadership on urban issues in international relations. In that role, she traveled to Singapore and Colombia to investigate how cities collaborate to tackle transnational challenges. Cathryn holds a master's degree in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School, a master's degree in European studies from the London School of Economics, and a bachelor's degree with honors in international relations and French civilization from Brown University. As a German and American national, Cathryn is proud to have crafted a bilingual, binational life in which she is able to engage in policy work on both sides of the Atlantic. Her areas of expertise include EU-US relations, including trade and security policy, and digital public policy in urban and national contexts. Her current work engages with how cities are working together to challenge the primacy of nation states on transnational issues, including climate change, pandemic disease, and terrorism. She's actually channeling all that work into an upcoming book project. In addition to her long list of professional achievements, Cathryn is overjoyed to be a mother to her son, Jonathan, who is currently a very talkative and bilingual toddler. So talkative. I'm very excited to hear what she and our fellow panelists have to say today, so please join me in welcoming Cathryn.
That was so generous, and from now on, we're just going to travel as a dual act because then, I can spare myself a lot of breath. Good morning, women of Wellesley. Good morning, women of Albright. Good morning. Ooh, that's good. So you're all here and present. I love that. So the last time I was here was in 2018. It was before I had my baby. So I'm really, really thrilled to be back. I've been here in this function with an array of incredible women. Now I think this is my 6th time. And so this room holds a lot of energy and potential and a lot of impact. So it's always thrilling to be back on your beautiful campus. I'm about to introduce you to these 4 formidable women. I'm thrilled that you've already had a chance to spend time with some of my favorite women. My former professor, Barbara Kellerman, who's fantastic, right? We're agreed. And Farah Pandith, who's a senior fellow in our program at the Belfer Center. And so I hope you had she has the most energy that, nobody else has as much energy as Farah Pandith. So I'm really glad that you have such an intriguing program, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it from some of you at lunch. But today we want to talk about how women who sat in your chairs not that long ago have made an impact on the world, how they have crafted choices, sometimes in difficult circumstances, sometimes in wildly opportunistic and opportune moments. And we want to see how they crafted their lives, how they touch people's lives, and how you might think about stepping off of this campus and doing the same for yourselves. And what was so revealing in the conversations that I had with all of them before we gathered here on the stage is how they've really found a way to trust themselves and to trust their instincts, which I think is particularly difficult when you're about to step out of a relatively safe environment like this one. So we want to delve into the questions of what they do and how they do it. So I'll introduce you to their very accomplished biographies, and then we'll kind of probe a little bit more on what that actually means for their day-to-day. And then we'll really get into the meat of it, what it means to forge a woman's life in international relations and in impact-driven work like all these 4 have. So I'm going to start in the way that it says on my piece of paper, because otherwise I'm going to flip back and forth. So if it's not clear who everybody is, they're going to raise their hand. So I'll start with Elli Blaine, who came in from Indianapolis, but spent time before she made her way to the middle of the country in Nicaragua and Boston, and she'll tell us about those different stations. But Elli's the kind of person who invests both her heart and her hands, and we'll talk about why that was important for her to find a career that does that. She's now an independent environmental consultant. She's been there for 3 years in Indianapolis, working on the thought issues that really, work on health outreach to serve underserved populations, on conservation policies. She's really had, she comes from a waste management background. But she's also been, and this I found really compelling, she's the assistant farm manager with a nonprofit called Indie Urban Acres. So she grows produce on a city-owned parkland. And so she's really hand, heart, body, and mind. Loriade, who is right here to my left, she's a senior program associate on the health team at Results for Development. I have to read this off because these are wonderful organizations, but sometimes hard to say. It's a nonprofit focusing on working with change agents around the world to create a self-sustaining systems for educated and healthy people. And Loriade's journey into this job is motivated by her strong desire to help impact communities in Francophone Africa. And she's done that in a lot of different ways. And what I find so compelling, again, is it comes out of her own biography of trying to reconcile, in some ways, what she learned here at Albright, how she thinks about the world, but also what speaks to her family roots and what drives at her heartstrings. So how each of these women have reconcile those pieces, I think, will be an interesting component of our conversation. Jalena is all the way to our far left, and she comes to us now from Hawaii because she's been out there filming. When we met after this illustrious gathering a few years ago when she was in your shoes, we were talking about how she could make a documentary in Myanmar because she wanted to tell the story of the women in Myanmar, and I was helping her out with some of the contacts there because already there, while she was saying, I used to film these sessions. And now she's the co-owner of her own production company. So in just a few years, she's really taken what may have seemed a student job into something quite incredible to empower women and minority filmmakers, to tell people's stories, to shine a light on underserved communities. So she's come a long way to be with us today. So thanks for that. And then last but certainly not least, Sang Hee, who is the senior member of this cohort only in the sense that she graduated with the class of 2011. She's now a program officer in global policy and advocacy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which all of you know well. She focuses there on advocacy and communications work for polio eradication, which even in 2020 is still a critical problem around the world, which seems odd and somewhat tragic. But she was a neuroscience and music major at Wellesley, and again, much like all of her compatriots over here, has a really interesting journey in how she finally ended up in this merging these interests in health, in serving underserved society. She's done a lot of work on mental health as well, into this communications angle. So I think we have lots to delve into. I asked them all for personal achievements too, and Elli and Sang Hee sent in particular nice stories, again, that merge things that you couldn't maybe do as a child and did later. So Sang Hee is now the mother of a proud puppy because she was never allowed to have pets as a child. So that will change your life. And Elli had a life-changing experience when she kayaked around the island that she grew up on. So whatever happened in that reflection, we might get into in our conversation. But I want to first start and have all of you talk about what you really do in your day jobs. I mean, these are impressive accomplishments, but take us through what your day looks like, what you do, how you think about your days of work, and really what matters to you. What gets you excited, Loriade?
Thank you, Cathryn. I would say there's no typical day in my job. I think my title explains a little bit of what I do in sense that I work on programs on the health team. So I support our programs in developing countries, mostly in Francophone countries in Africa. And I help whether it's like contracts with our partners, local partners, invoicing and things like that, but I also help with the technical side of the work. So developing work plans and developing ideas on how to really impact, create impact in the countries where we work. And there's no, like I said, it's really part of what I enjoy about the work is that there's no typical day. There are problems that arise every day that I have to help solve. There are situations that put me in contact with people that I would have never imagined to speak to, like ministers in countries or government officials that I, at my age, at this stage in my career, I never thought I would have spoken to. So that is what I really enjoy the most, I think.
She's being very humble because she has a number of academic degrees. And in between her degree and between graduate school, she did a lot of consulting where she interfaced with lots of different communities. Loriade, can you weigh in can you tell this group why it was so important to focus on health outcomes in Francophone Africa for you and how you brought your own story together in choosing this particular position?
Sure. So I was born in the United States, but my parents are from Nigeria and Cameroon. And they also work in the development world. And I grew up as what I like to say, a third culture kid in various countries, mostly in African countries. So it was very important for me growing up and seeing what my parents were doing to understand this sense that I have to give back and really improve the communities that I join and support the people that I work with. So, and I chose Francophone countries partly because of my background. Again, I grew up in Tunisia, Cameroon, and Côte d'Ivoire. So speak French, and it's been very empowering for me to just be able to use that background and really make a difference, which is what we're called to do as Wellesley students, I would say.
So Elli, take us back to before the decision you made to go to Indianapolis, but talk a little bit about, too, this whole point that Loriade made about investing in the community in which you find yourself, wherever it might be around the world, because, you've had quite the trajectory, Nicaragua, Boston, Indianapolis. That's an interesting roadmap.
Right. I think it's really important to respond to the community in which you're in. For me, it is... When I got the email to be on this panel, I was first struck by, I'm not doing global work. I felt like I'm not doing global work. I'm doing work that's really embedded in a community. And I also have switched that community pretty frequently in my life. So I think the most important thing is to really connect with the people in which you find, yourself in that environment. So moving to Indianapolis, it is a very foreign city for me. It was a very foreign city for me. And so I needed to really put myself out there. And I think I encourage all of you to really just put yourself out there. It doesn't have to be in a professional manner necessarily at first. And just learn and look around you, understand what people are facing in the community in which you're in order to respond to that and really develop a more nuanced approach to what you're doing. I have, I think, focused on more equity issues as well as environmental issues throughout, my path, but that has looked very different in each place. And I've tried to kind of pick up threads throughout my work and craft, new ways of looking at those issues in the new places that I'm in.
So can you talk a little bit specifically about, how you were taking your experiences that you had before you got to Indianapolis? I mean, I know that you networked yourself into your position. You spent a lot of time sitting down with people to understand the community in which you were entering. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of, networking, but also that listening aspect to really, get a better comprehension of how you might forge your career there, and then how you develop that into this balance of the practical and the consulting components.
So just a story about listening. I was in Nicaragua, and my task there was to understand the value chains of recyclables, so plastic water bottles mostly, getting from the Atlantic coast of the country to the city to then be transferred to China to be processed into a valuable material. So that seems like kind of a daunting task. And really what it looked like was me walking down the street and meeting someone who was doing this work, right? Who is going to a landfill and picking out plastic water bottles, taking them home, cleaning them, stepping on them in order to compact them and get them into a transferable, form. So, it's just, listening, I think, takes the form of just engaging in a really human way with someone. I just tried to develop the language, both of, verbal language, but also, heart language, just being empathetic. And I was able to travel with this man from one coast to another, in the back of a truck, in a hammock, overnight on a train. And that's, that little story, it doesn't feel like you're doing big work, but it's important to listen to, to those experiences, I think, in order to understand how things really happen, and that it's people's lives that are at stake and livelihoods that are at stake, doing environmental work sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And I think, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but, that is true of Nicaragua and Indianapolis. So, humans are humans. And if you want to do public policy work, that's first and foremost what you're doing. You're doing work with other humans. And so to be present in the way that certainly these four women have, and we expect all of you to be, which you want to be, which is why you're here, it makes me excited about the near-term future. Sang Hee, you have such an interesting story in terms of how you ended up doing this, because you started out here with, neuroscience and music, which, yes, could seem proximate, perhaps, but also maybe not so proximate. So how did you, in putting that together, and you had really a quintessential experience in your Albright time, how did you parlay this into this particular journey to have you end up in Seattle, Washington?
So it's funny that you say that neuroscience and music could be seen as proximate, because back when I was studying those two fields, everyone was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you doing? But I was really interested in how music affects the brain and kind of how, and that intersection of the field is really interesting to me. So I thought entering into Albright, my first day, I was still working in a lab at Beth Israel doing that kind of research. I thought I would go into that field, whether it was a more clinical application about how music can help rehabilitate stroke patients, or just furthering that field of research because it was so new at the time. And then I came and did these 3 weeks, and I was sitting in these seats. I had all these very accomplished experts come in from totally different fields. We were just saying earlier, we kind of wish we'd had this kind of panel at the time. Albright was too new, I think, to have alums yet, but to see someone a little bit more mid-career would have been, to me, I think, a little helpful. But anyway, so we had these 3 weeks of, you're grouped into these groups with women who, I don't know if you all knew each other, but I knew no one from my group. We were from completely different backgrounds, and I was just telling Elli earlier, like, one of my teammates, she was asking me, like, so what exactly is a virus anyway? And I was like, well, what is a supply chain? And we were just starting from, like, the true basics of how to even communicate with each other. But so to be listening to all of these incredible experts by day and then going back to the dorm at night and being like, okay, so how are we going to tackle this challenge and put together a presentation? Was really transformative for me. But I remember sitting in these seats and listening to these leaders in their field and realizing that, I'm way more excited and inspired in kind of that macro level thinking in global affairs. That's why I'd applied to be in Albright anyways. I had a lot of interest in global affairs, but I spent most of my time in either the science labs or in Jewett practicing. And so it seemed like a huge leap to me to go from that to global affairs, which sounds very big. But I just realized that mindset of thinking about, okay, I might not want to be the doctor across the table from a patient. I actually want to be the person who's thinking about how to get those doctors to the places in the most need. Or maybe they're not even doctors. Maybe you have community health workers. Just that kind of thinking, I realized, was something I was much more interested in. So 3 months before graduation, I completely changed my career trajectory. I told my lab I'm not going to stay after graduation. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do, but I think I'm interested in public health, so I'm going to go figure out what that means. And so I took a 2-year position at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York. They have a Center for Health Policy and Outcomes. Again, knew nothing about cancer, but they did public health research and they did work on disparities. And so that was an area I was really interested in. So spent 2 years interviewing actually a lot of women going through breast cancer treatment in different health centers around New York City. So, which felt like a little mini world in a lot of ways because each borough was so different, each clinic, different languages, women from completely different income levels, but all going through this experience of really intensive breast cancer treatment. And that meant different things to different women. People who were coming to Sloan Kettering had private insurance and lived on the Upper East Side, or sometimes flew in from other countries. And then I'll go to a clinic in Harlem where these women were at risk of losing their jobs because they were taking too much time off to go through treatment. So did 2 years of that, realized I really, really like public health. I like the systems thinking. I care about serving the underserved. I understand a little bit more about what this actually looks like on a day-to-day. And a lot of the people I was working with actually were epidemiologists. So I went off to go get a master's in public health, in epidemiology and global health, which if you look at what I'm doing today still doesn't make a lot of sense. So my whole career is quite nonlinear in that sense. So I went to Columbia, got my master's, did a lot of training in data analysis, which was great. And the global health track there was also great. I got to spend 6 months working abroad with the WHO in Mexico City and the government of Mexico, which was also a really interesting experience for a lot of reasons. But at the end of the 2 years, I was actually really frustrated with having been trained in the hard sciences and in data, that we were being trained in how to gather data and analyze that data and then present that data to other data analysts or other researchers. And that just wasn't the audience I was looking for when I was interested in global health. My audience wasn't other people who understand statistical analysis. I wanted to learn how to break that down and communicate in different cultures and communities, but I had no training in that. And I think often in academia, we found ourselves sort of vilifying the media to say, oh, they make things sound so dramatic, like they don't get all of the nuances. But media will always be there, and it's a really important tool, and I wanted to learn how to use that tool. And so I took a job after getting an MPH in epidemiology at a consulting firm that does global health advocacy and communications. It was a hard sell, I would say, to get myself there into that firm because in my interview, they were like, so neuroscience and epidemiology, why do you want to do this? But I think that's sort of been a theme throughout, at least my career has been, I kind of like being the odd one out because I find that I certainly learn the most. And if I can convince myself, or if I can convince the other people to let me into that group, I have so much to learn. I often find that just having that kind of different perspective on things also helps me to be a much more valuable team member. Sorry, I'm going.
Yeah, no, I think this,
right
but
now.
I think this is a perfect theme that connects to Jalena's story because here we were sitting at Pete's down the street, and she had she's a junior, I think, at the time, and she had a pretty, clear idea of how she was going to talk herself into something and stick to her guns. And so it's not an easy world. It's a very competitive world, a media, film, narrative, storytelling world. And you decided to take a very specific angle on it. So how did you decide then to combine not only, what you were trying to do in documentary film, but also to put a spin on it that it should be from the perspective of, again, communities that don't often get to have their own voices represented, but also don't end up behind the camera a fair amount?
Well, I think a lot of it did spring from my time with Albright as well. I remember when I was a fellow, one thing that really struck me was the lack of media in the presentations. I think there was one picture that was shown, but there was, of course, a lot of storytelling because when we talk about global issues, there's always storytelling involved. Otherwise, it's just abstract numbers and facts. And I studied political science and CAMS at Wellesley, and I had just come back from a semester abroad at film school, which was very interesting and very different from Wellesley. And I came back and I just realized that all these stories were being told on behalf of people, and through the media of film and other forms of media, people could tell their own stories, or it would be easier to tell your own stories and bring them kind of to a global audience in a global scale. So I made my first documentary with my stipend from Albright, and then I did some extra fundraising and made a film about female construction workers in Myanmar. I feel like, knowing what I know now, would I take a trip to Myanmar and do a production? Potentially not. But I think there's something about being really young and ambitious, and being at Wellesley, being in these kind of spaces that make things that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And so I would say, like, it's such an important time to take advantage of. I know when people are out of college, they always say, like, it's so great, like, take advantage of it, and it doesn't really mean that much. But I know people seem really busy
Everybody's resonating
now.
with that point.
Yeah.
Did you see these smiles?
It's like, I know people are busy now, and it's like, Wellesley, everyone's doing so much stuff. But once you have a real job, it's so much more. Am I right? And then your friends are in all different places. And so I feel like this time is such a beautiful time to do collaborations and different projects and any of the things that you want to do. Like, you know, what you were saying about having this kind of safety. I feel like because you have that safety, it's the perfect time to do things that are bold or that maybe you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have, like, this community.
What I find remarkable about all four of you, and frankly everybody that I've met who's been an Albright Fellow, is that sort of innate trust that you have not only in your own abilities, but in your own sense of curiosity. Which, given the state of the world today and everything that's coming at us, speaking of how the media has changed at every minute, that could be quite dispiriting. And you could say, look, I'm in Indianapolis or I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts. What am I going to do that, like, moves the meter forward? And so I wanted to ask all four of you, what do you think those ingredients are? Whether it's from your upbringing, your time here, what begets that trust? And then as you're making critical decisions for yourself, how do you reconcile, your gut feeling that might be informed by your values, what you did here, your friends and compatriots on that journey, and your head, where you say, well, this might be good on my CV, or people will appreciate reading that, or that's how I'm going to move up in the world. How do you reconcile those things? So, Loriade, how did you find your kind of true north to kind of, keep on doing what you were doing, or change paths in between when you kind of felt, I don't know, this doesn't really feel right?
I think I'm still trying to figure it out, to be honest. I think I definitely have moments when I question myself and the decisions that I've made, and even some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of where I want to be in my career and in my life in a couple of years. But something that's been really important for me is just trusting my gut. I think it was mentioned earlier, this is when I was thinking back to my senior year at Wellesley, I thought, I have to have everything figured out. I have to know what's going on, what's happening in my life. And I wasn't really listening to what my heart was telling me necessarily. I thought, this is what comes next. This is what makes the most sense. This, what sort of societal expectations. Whereas now I'm much more comfortable trusting myself and what feels right, what my heart is telling me in terms of the opportunities I should pursue. So I would say, don't be afraid of that, trusting yourself, and the ideas that come to mind in the strangest places at the strangest moments in your life sometimes can be some of the most rewarding experiences of your life.
How did you negotiate that in practice? Can you give us an example? I know you went to graduate school relatively early, and then you made a couple of other interesting decisions. How did you, when you saw an opportunity, did you then seek out people to support that idea, even if it was gut-driven, or did you feel like, no, I have to kind of soldier this forth on my own? Like, how did that work in practice? Can you give it a concrete example?
Sure. So I went to graduate school right after Wellesley. I went to get a master's in public health. And I think halfway through my degree, which was a 2-year degree program, I went to do an internship in Tanzania, which is a part of Africa that I had never been to, a country that I didn't know, and it was a very transformative experience. Like I said earlier, I grew up on the African continent. My parents are from African countries, but this is a part of the world that I wasn't very familiar with. And it just made me realize that there is so much about the continent that I really wanted to discover. And that when I call myself, and I'm proud to call myself an African, I just feel like there are so many experiences that I have yet to have on the continent. So in my second year of my degree program, I decided that I was going to go back to work on the continent. I started applying to jobs. Things didn't necessarily work out. But in November of that year, I said, you know what? I'm going to take this leap of faith. And I literally went home to Nigeria without a job, without anything except my spring and summer clothes, literally. And I was like, I'm going to figure it out. But this is what I feel is right. This is what I want to do for my personal life. And we'll figure out the professional later. And it was very hard because I don't know, I mean, we all come from different backgrounds, but I come from a culture where parents, you know, have a lot of expectations, and this idea
Look at all
that,
these women who are like, mm-hmm.
so this idea that I would literally leave the United States and come back to the continent without a job, my parents were out of their minds. They were literally like, what are you doing? But I still found support from my friends, from some of the people that I reached out to on LinkedIn, in my Albright network, actually, and ended up figuring out a couple of opportunities. Like you said, I did some consulting work and also did a fellowship program in Senegal. So right before coming back to the States about a year ago, I was actually based in Senegal for a year as part of a fellowship program. That I found out through my connections. Basically.
And have your parents come around to trusting you?
They have, but I think part of it is because I'm back in the States, though. I think.
We can talk about re-education campaigns for parents as part of the Q&A. Elli, how about you? You had to, when you moved out to Indianapolis, you also, came with all this international experience, and then here you were, and you kind of had to find your way. How did you stay close to what you thought you trusted? How did you reconcile, what you thought might have to happen on your CV with what you saw on the ground and your own feelings toward that and your life, what you were going to do day to day?
Yeah, so similar to Loriade, I think before or up until the point of graduation and getting a job, I felt like I was on a path where I had certain milestones that I had to achieve. And, it would only be through those achievements that I would, progress in life. And so after graduation, it was almost expected that I would, find a job, and I wanted to as well. And so I worked, I guess, through my Albright experience and studying abroad, I was able to do a lot of, or some work internationally. And after that work, I expected that I would continue doing international work. I was on the path of doing work between Mexico and Arizona, looking at recycling development there. And that fell through kind of at the last minute. And that really was kind of a triggering point for me that I needed to, change my path. And in that course, I really had to look within myself, and I think each and every one of you know at the core of who you are, what your values are, and, those can be boiled down to some pretty simple things, I think. So when you're facing those choices, I think, instead of looking out first, I find it very valuable to look within first, and then, even write that down, have that somewhere where it's easily accessible so that you can match up any opportunities that come your way with those core values. Those jobs might look very different, what you're actually doing day to day, but the values can stay true to yourself. So I ended up looking back to the States and was interested, there's so much need here, right? There's so many people's lives. There are millions of people's lives here that can be affected just by your work. And so that's how I found myself back in Boston. And after about 3 years of working with the company I was working with here, I really felt burned out, and I felt like I was doing environmental work, but not socially good work, and that was something that was really important to me. I didn't feel like I was having those meaningful interactions with people to actually get at the core of what I want to do. And so it was actually a personal reason that drove me to move to Indianapolis. I met the woman who's now my wife, and this was in 2015. I moved a year later, and that was a very hard choice for me. I did not expect to move for someone or for that personal reason. I felt very conflicted, and I made the choice to leave my job. And actually, serendipitously, I told my manager, my direct supervisor, and co-owner of the company that I was going to leave on the same day that he also made an announcement that he was leaving the company. And we together were it's a small team, and we were, pretty much the sales team together. And he's vice president of this company, and it really challenged me to think, can I do this? Am I leaving the company in a time where I'm, the second knowledge base? Do I need to transfer that information? How do I do this? How do I stay true to myself? And I ended up, saying, I need to do this for myself. If I stay in Boston longer, if I stay with this company longer, it's doing it for them. Yes, it would be good, and there would be a lot of value there, but it wasn't like honoring that path that I already chosen. So I think moving to Indianapolis too, that was another move that really, everybody was asking me, why are you moving there? It's in the middle of the country. It's not a big city. There's no diversity. Like, what are you doing? And I think you'll find the people and the work that really speaks to those core values no matter where you go.
So I think that's fundamental, because you've heard something about choice points and how you navigate them. You've heard something about what, from the outside, depending on who you talk to, might be seen as failure or straying from the path that you were given. And how do you negotiate that? And does it ever really feel like failure to you? Because you've heard from these two women that no, in fact, it felt like really the opposite. Right? It felt like an opportunity. But how do you then resist the narrative when people are telling you, you're not fulfilling your potential, or, is this the right choice? How do you withstand that and kind of negotiate for yourself what's valuable to you? And then from these two women, and we're going to hear from our other two colleagues, how do you find a community with whom you can engage on those issues? They might not agree with you on every point, but, where are the confidants, and some of them will be in the room with you today, who will have your back, even though maybe on the actual choice they might not agree, but who will listen to you and have you have it out so that you can figure out what's right for you, so that you can then go and have that impactful work. And I think both of them have spoken to, what it means to be a responsible leader. How do you negotiate staying with an organization, keeping that organization safe or stable? Or how do you kind of see how that fits together? And we'll talk to our other two colleagues too about how personal choices then begin to become moments of negotiation in your career and where you find yourself. So, Sang Hee, I wanted to see if you could speak directly to those points, because you too have faced 3 or 4 big choice points where you kind of had to trust your instincts, but you also had to reconcile certain moments, incisive moments in your personal life.
Yeah, I guess I'll speak mostly to that second point. I also, like Elli, made a move for a partner. I had been in New York for a few years, working at this consulting firm on comms and advocacy. And then my husband got a job out in California. And we had done some long distance while we were dating, kind of had done a little bit of light negotiating about where are we spending our time and what do our careers look like. And so after we got married, we actually had a list of cities and places that we were open to should opportunities arise. I insisted that we had a previously agreed upon list because in case things came up that we wouldn't be having live debates about is this yes or no. We had already talked about places where we'd be like, okay, if that's a place we've already talked about, we're comfortable with it. And so he got a job offer out in the Bay Area in California, and that I had said, for ever going to the West Coast, Bay Area is fine with me. Just kind of ironic because I knew very little about the Bay Area, I realized once we moved there. But we had that discussion previously, and so I said, okay, it's your turn. I will come with you. I didn't have a plan in terms of my career, which was, again, very unlike what I thought I would do. I spent most of my 4 years at Wellesley planning and replanning for the years ahead, which if I could tell myself, my 18 or 20-year-old self, you can try to stop planning because opportunities will arise that you don't even know about, and it's more about just grabbing onto those. And so we made the move out to California. I quit my job, and I started doing some independent consulting because I knew I wanted to keep doing the work. I didn't want to put a pause, but that was also really scary of how do I start doing that and sort of building a business and branding myself as an expert in something that also felt kind of uncomfortable. But
a little bit of imposter syndrome there.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Of do I really have a skill set that I can sell? And but I did that for a bit, and then I got a call from UNICEF saying, we have a need, we know you, will you come work for us? So I started doing that and going, ironically, back to New York quite a bit for work. But that call came actually because they were a partner I had worked with in the past in a previous job. And that's actually how I came to the Gates Foundation as well, was these are partners I had worked with. They knew me and they knew my work. And so whether it's personal or community level or just within your work, you never know how that's going to pan out. So just always be the best that you can at what you're doing, be kind to people, like that really goes a long way. And then a year later, I said, okay, it's my turn now, I'm going to Seattle. So managing two careers, I think particularly nowadays when jobs take you everywhere, is really tough. But if you have someone or people around you who can help you navigate that together and kind of figure out, how do we make this work together? While each person gets to stay true to what they want to do, what their values are, I think that's really, really valuable. But it certainly isn't easy. And I don't think we're at a point where I say, okay, this is now what the next 10 years of my life will look like. I think there are many more twists and turns ahead. But it's really about that. For me, it's sort of that gut feeling of like, this feels right, even if it's uncomfortable. Those don't always line up that way.
I think modern careers are the way that you've described ultimately. Just before we pass on, can you just say, because I know how important the Albright cohort was to you and how important your group has been to you going forward. Can you just, maybe this doesn't apply, but in these somewhat difficult choice points you had to navigate, were you able to reach back to friends? And, there's a difference between friends and confidants, and we might get into that. But who did you reach back to kind of check yourself or check your thinking or your processing?
Yeah, my Albright group, who, like I said, I didn't know them at all, and they were totally random women to me when we were first placed together. Are now some of my closest confidants. One of them was a bridesmaid at my wedding. We've lived together in different apartments in New York over the years. We continue to be this cohort, this sort of group where we're cheerleaders for each other, but we also kind of challenge each other. When someone says, I'm thinking about doing this next, our first thing is we'll support you in your decision, but also why? Do we have that conversation? But we've built that trust over the years of knowing that person, what they care about, what their ambitions were. And so when they share information, when I'm sharing, I'm thinking about doing this next, or sometimes I'll just say, oh, by the way, now I'm moving to Seattle. And everyone is like, what? We can have that conversation at a depth that I'm not necessarily able to with other people. And I think a lot of that is grounded in the fact that we went through 3 really intense weeks together. So there's certainly a group that I continue to turn back to. And I think another sort of set of people I would say that I've relied on over the years is mentors. So whether that's people who are a few years ahead of me in my career whose paths seem interesting, or people who are faculty at the schools that I've been to, or who are running programs that I'm interested in, I've always made sort of a conscious decision to really reach out to those people and just explicitly ask, like, I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do next, but I'm really interested in what you're doing. I would love to learn from you. Would you be willing to spend some time with me? And so they've often been a really great resource for me. I have a couple of Wellesley professors who are still my mentors to this day. Certainly at Columbia, which is a much, much bigger school, I like semi-stalked a couple of professors when I first got accepted to say, you're running this program in global mental health. I'm incredibly interested. Do you have any open positions, or could I just spend some time talking to you? And that those professors also continue to be my mentors in my career path. So,
Jalena, how does that work when you're out, in an environment where you're trying to, tell stories, but then there's also the craft of filmmaking. You came from this liberal arts background, and, you had a couple of worlds to negotiate. You already indicated that it was, somewhat striking to go to film school and then come back to Wellesley and negotiate those experiences. But then how did you figure out, how did you stick to that gut feeling while maybe everybody else was off to consulting or public health, or, how did you kind of stay your ground there for you? You said that first shoot was a little tricky. And then find people, mentors, confidants, sparring partners to kind of help you negotiate that path for yourself.
I think for me, first, I think this idea of trusting your gut is like the theme of adulthood, and learning how to do that comes from within mostly. And so we can tell you all the tools that we gave, but it really has to be something that you just feel within yourself. For me, it was really a pairing of passion and strategic thinking. And I think Albright helped a lot with this like macro level thinking and thinking about like, what are the resources you need? What are the resources you have? And how can you bridge the two? Some career paths are more easy to approach than others. Film and TV is not a very easy one to approach. It's not very approachable. The Career Center here, at least in my time, didn't have that many resources for it. So I thought about, what is it that I want to do? What is it that I'm passionate about? And how can I get there? So I also moved back home after I graduated. I was babysitting and doing a bunch of different film programs when I first moved back home to raise enough money to get like some starter camera equipment that I needed. When I was starting to pursue filmmaking, the advice that I got about how to raise funds for films was ask the people in your family that they have more money than you think they have, or go into debt and like take things out on credit cards. I was like, neither of those are really options for me, but I'll come up with my own way. So I think when you're charting your own path, like that's when your community comes into play even more. And there's like the concept of vertical networking versus horizontal networking. So vertical networking is when you're talking to mentors, you're talking to people that are like mid to late level in career who you can look up to, it's extremely valuable, and you can get some time with them, some advice, like I did with Cathryn. Like those are really important relationships. But to me, something even more important, particularly in my field, is horizontal networking, which is like who is around you that's doing the same kind of things that you're doing, and how are you going to work together? A breakthrough for me was when I started my production company, Breaktide Productions. We're an all-woman of color video production company. And we make original documentaries ranging from topics like indigenous resistance in Hawaii, where I just came from, lead poisoning in Oakland, and political resistance in Kashmir. And then we also do client projects and national video campaigns for clients like Nike, LinkedIn, and Thinks. So we've tried to create this sustainable idea of filmmaking where there is both like financial resources and creative outlet. And I think that's a balance that I've really been trying to strike in my work. And having a community, particularly of other filmmakers, has been influential in that trajectory. And it's so nice to be back here at this time in my life where I feel like now I'm really thinking more about how can I put myself into more spaces like Albright, where it's people from different fields that are working on different things, and we can think about like how can these different aspects, different problems be solved through a collaborative and multidisciplinary approach.
So I think what's critical that you've just heard is both, that you uphold these bridges for yourself, that you're always on the lookout to where I can learn, where I can listen. You put your curiosity first. You engage, and you're not afraid to ask because, as all these women have shared, is when you ask that question, people don't turn you down when you're asking them about their expertise, their life, and their choices, because there's far too few forums like this one where people can ask those kind of honest questions. So people are hunger for that. So if you go and put yourself in that asking position, people will respond by and large. All four of these women have spoken to that. And I think now, again, I think that component that you also then begin probably earlier than you might think to see yourself as a bridge between communities and realize that you have value to bring to conversations like that, I think is an important one. We always stick labels on it in terms of giving back or being present or whatever. But this is ultimately what makes the world go round. So, not to underestimate your own viewpoint, what you're picking up along the way to where you can serve as a bridge to communities where you're seeing connections because you've had this interdisciplinary background, because you're coming together in this group that others might not. And so you can be really helpful, taking kind of yourself out of the game, but making connections in a way that, other people might not be able to because you might see a larger horizon. And so I think that, ultimately will end up serving all of you really well because it'll come easy to you. That's second nature, which is why you're here.